two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. I'm here today with Paul Ortiz, who teaches at Cornell ILR, labor history. That is what we will be getting into today. These are slightly odd times. There's a dominant government in the United States that wants to take us back into the 19th century. But meanwhile, there's all sorts of interest in socialism. Paul Ortiz, I guess you wanted to start with the Roaring Twenties. What were they really like?
The Roaring Twenties. I'm so glad you asked because actually earlier today, I gave a lecture on the novel by F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby. And that novel, probably more than any other piece of literature, is responsible for sharing with us this idea of the Roaring Twenties. Um, Many of us read it in high school, perhaps, or maybe in college. And when I read it in high school, I was a shipyard kid. I hated the book. I thought, after reading Richard Wright and Ellison and Sylvia Plath and Kurt Vonnegut, they gave me this book, F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby. And I'm like, all these rich people having these big parties, I don't care about them. Um, but when you delve deeper into the book, Teresa, you get the underside, the underbelly of the Roaring Twenties. The message at F. Scott Fitzgerald, and he was not a socialist, and he went to these parties too, by the way, but the message he's trying to get across is the society was being grievously harmed by wealthy people. It wasn't just about wealth inequality. There's a lot of that in The Great Gatsby, but it's about the harm that people like Tom Buchanan, Jay Gatsby, Daisy Buchanan, Arthur Rothstein, the guy who fixed the 1919 World Series, the really rich people, how they were running the economy into the ground, how they were getting away literally with murder. That's one of the dramatic penultimate scenes of the novel, if you remember, Daisy Buchanan and Jay Gatsby running down the road and running down a worker and just driving off as if nothing happened. And so it's really a shocking novel. It's very violent. But people, especially rich Americans, have misread it. You may remember Donald Trump had a big Gatsby party the same week that Congress cut SNAP benefits, and so the Roaring Twenties wasn't so roaring for most Americans. And this is the thing to understand about the coming Great Depression. When you teach the Great Depression, when we learn about it in the books, it begins in 1929. But Teresa, I'm just old enough to have interviewed men and women who were organizers with the Congress, or first the Committee for Industrial Organizing, or the CIO. I've interviewed former sharecroppers who worked the land in the 20s and the 30s. And what they told me was, look, we were always in a Great Depression in the Black Belt of Alabama, in Western Texas, in Northern Florida. It was always hard times in mid-state New York. I mean, a lot of people were suffering here in this region in the 1910s and 1920s. So the Great Depression, in many ways, is the great equalizer. It spread the suffering upward, if you will, and outward. And it demonstrated to millions of people capitalism didn't work. Didn't work then, doesn't work now. And the interesting thing about novels like The Great Gatsby, and there's so many others, I really encourage your listeners to think about learning about the New Deal through literature. Read Mary Heaton Vorse's Labor's New Millions, a magnificent kind of memoir of this young feminist reporter, the greatest labor journalist I think this country's ever had, Mary Vorse, who took part, who was an eyewitness to the Little Steel organizing campaign, who was shot in the face actually during that campaign, who saw the brutality of the company towns, who had to come face to face with the Pinkerton gun thugs and everything. But it was such a when the stock market crashed in 1929, unemployment shot up. It was higher than ever, and it was chronic. It wasn't this cyclical thing. It stayed pegged to 25 to 50% in many parts of the country. In this part of the country, and I'm talking about mid-state New York, it was awful. It ran as high as 40, 50, sometimes 60% in some of the adjacent counties to Tompkins County. And so people everywhere were looking for answers. And one of the things I love about working class, or I'll call it proletarian literature, I know that concept is probably a little overused, but I want our viewers to look at books like Thomas Bell's Out of This Furnace. Thomas Bell's Out of This Furnace. If you want to learn about the experience of steelworkers in Western Pennsylvania, in towns like Homestead, Braddock, the Mon Valley, read Thomas Bell's Out of This Furnace. It takes us from the 1890s, the Homestead lockout, Andrew Carnegie, his battle with the Amalgamated Iron Workers Union, the infamous lockout, and then the non-union era, the 4 decades of brutal labor relations, and then the rise of the CIO. And the reason I mention that book is it's a family book. Thomas Bell was the grandson of Hungarian immigrants. Bell, by the way, was his anglicized name. That was not his Hungarian name. But he changed his name like so many Eastern European comrades, in the 20s and 30s to kind of anglicize it, make it easier, more comfortable for kind of the older, kind of white folks, if you will. But the reason I mention Out of This Furnace by Thomas Bell is that he gives us the beginning of the Great Depression from a working class perspective. And the first thing he says, he has these working class steelworkers, their wives, their children, talking about the chronic, terrible unemployment, the economic downturn of these big steel towns, mills that employed sometimes 10, 15, sometimes 20,000 workers. And the thing that the mill workers said is, rich people caused this mess. The best thing for them to do would be to keep their mouths shut. But instead, they kept running their mouths and they kept on saying, oh, this is just a temporary downturn. Don't get angry. Don't protest. Don't say anything. We're in charge. We're going to solve the problem. And Thomas Bell heard from his elders who worked in the mills, those rich people should have, well, I'm not going to say it. It would be cursing and not right on the radio, but or on YouTube, whatever. But basically, there was this crisis in capitalism, and the capitalists made the big error of trying to come out front and explain what had went wrong. That was error number one, because there were enough people at that time, Theresa, and this is where we get into the topic of socialism and the idea of workers making a new deal. And this is what's happening today. I'll make this connection between 1930 and 2026. You have all of these capitalists and their news organs, like whatever MSNBC is called now, Fox News, NPR, et cetera, et cetera. They're going nuts about the rise of DSA and socialist candidates. And they're saying, we got to stop these DSA people, but they're not saying why they're gaining so much traction. They're gaining so much traction because capitalism is a mess. It doesn't work. The spokespeople are people like Elon Musk. They're people like Peter Thiel. They're fascists. In fact, Thiel has a book that's come out, and he's very open about this fact, right? In the 30s, it was people like Henry Ford, the Rockefeller family, who would spout their mouths off. Henry Ford gave this famous congressional testimony early in the 30s. And when Congress asked him, Mr. Ford, as America's largest employer, what are you going to do to make the situation better for our workers? And he said, I'm going to start moving my plants to Ireland because I'm tired. American workers are lazy. They drink too much. Irish workers are desperate for a job. They'll work for whatever I pay them, and this is how arrogant these capitalists were. And so more and more ordinary people started thinking, this isn't right. These people don't have the answer to this problem. And the other component to this, Teresa, and I don't want to, you know me, I can ramble on and on, but I'll just say one more thing and kind of pause. The other thing is that there were enough members of the Socialist Party, of the Communist Party. I'm thinking of people like Rose Chernin, who I want to talk about in a couple minutes, of the unemployed movement before we get to industrial union organizing in the early 30s, there's this unemployed movement, and it's powerful, it's organic. And there were many, many comrades from the Communist Party, from the Socialist Party, as you know. There you had the Third International. There were people who broke from the Third International over what they perceived as the Soviet Union's control of the Third. And so they formed a Fourth International, right? Socialists have always been argumentative, cantankerous people, right? We love to argue. And so it was no different back then. But the
And
reason I mentioned the unemployed movement, and again, I'll kind of stop there, is that the unemployed movement begins to question how power works in the society and begins to really broadcast and promote an idea of working class socialism. And what I mean by this is the idea that if my neighbor is having problems, I need to be there for them. You have my back, I have your back. That's the fundamental grassroots kind of socialism is we watch out for each other. We don't let our neighbors starve, by God. Anything else but not that. And then the second thing is we begin to analyze and we begin to say, hey, these employers and our government need to take some responsibility. They need to at least provide short-term, food assistance, perhaps, rent forgiveness, stopping foreclosures, because foreclosures were running full steam ahead during the early Great Depression. And that's something that the early unemployed movements began to picket, to use direct action. And socialists were right there with an analysis and saying that capitalism cannot resolve these contradictions. We can't put a Band-Aid over this. The economy is not coming back unless we do something radically different.
and I have also experienced an unemployed council, as I think it was called, here in Ithaca during the Reagan years. At that time, I was unemployed. I don't actually remember where things went with the unemployed council, but that was about the time when I joined DSOC, which became DSA. And at that point, activism turned toward organizing the Cornell workforce. What role did socialism play in the rebirth of the labor movement and the unemployed movement?
Well, first of all, socialists, and Teresa, I know that most of your viewers are aware of this, but I don't want to take anything for granted. Socialism in the United States goes back a long ways. And it goes back, the most convenient place to kind of take a look at are the labor parties of the 1820s and 1830s. Ithaca, by the way, Tompkins County had a labor party. And not all of the labor parties from that era, we call that the Jacksonian era in American politics, not all of them were socialists, but a lot of them were. They advocated for municipal ownership of the means of production in many cases. They advocated for things like, pensions. The most important thing they advocated for in some ways, because they had some success, was a public school system, but a very different kind of public school system, Teresa, than the system we have now. The public school system that labor socialists in Tompkins County in the 1830s, or Philadelphia, which had big labor parties, or New York City, obviously big labor parties also, the kind of public education that those labor socialists were advocating for in the 1830s was a school system that taught working class people that rich people were their enemy. The language they used was the many and the few. It was the same language that the founding fathers, so-called, had used during the American Revolution. Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton, and all, they said society is divided between the many and the few. And the labor socialists of the 1830s said we're part of the many, right, against the few. The few were the bankers, the lawyers, the slave power, especially during that time. And so the reason I went back to the 1830s and now fast forward to the 1920s and 30s is that socialism had always been a powerful tendency in U.S. society. And I want us to remember that it's different branches of socialism. I want to connect also anarchism and communism as well, because oftentimes they overlapped. Oftentimes, if you were in Chicago, for example, Chicago was the world's premier radical working class socialist city of the 1880s, right? That's why the Haymarket happened there. That's why the struggle for the 8-hour day happened there. If you go to the cemetery where the Haymarket martyrs are buried today, in a Christian cemetery, you'll see hammers and sickles. You'll see anarchist signs. You'll see IWW slogans, right? It's just so uplifting to just sit there and see this amazing socialist, radical, communist iconography. But that had always been an element of working class life in this country, and it didn't just come from Europe. That's the other thing I want to mention because I can't. My Chicago comrades would never forgive me. They always remind me, Paul, in this city, socialism it was brought up from Mexico. Anarchism came up from the Caribbean. As much as it was, the Jewish Bund, of course, was very big, very prominent in Chicago, New York City, especially on the East Side. But also radical ideas, feminism from Mexico, anarchism, anarcho-syndicalism. Cuban workers bring that to the United States in the 1880s, 1890s. So these tendencies were always there. This is why there were Red Scares time and time again. A lot of us have heard of McCarthyism, but before that, there's the Palmer raids during World War I. There's the attacks on the IWW, a socialist, anarcho-syndicalist trade union. John Dos Passos in the USA Trilogy writes very compellingly about the attacks on the IWW. By the way, I grew up in a county, Teresa, that was sandwiched literally between the place where the Centralia Massacre had happened in 1919 on one side, and then the Everett Massacre had happened in 1917. These were government-sponsored massacres against IWW socialist labor organizers in Everett, Washington, and in Centralia, Washington. So fast forward to the late 20s, there are, a lot of people are familiar with the term salts, right? A lot of times, young college students are idealistic. A lot of them come from the working class, like I did, and they go right into, they engage in an activity called salting. That is, they'll go into a workplace and try to participate or perhaps lead or be a part of a union campaign, right? And so that was happening a lot in the 20s and the 30s, although they didn't call it that, right? They didn't call it salting necessarily, but there was enough elements of socialism that people began talking about like stage one. And this is oversimplification, but stage one, the American response to the Great Depression, I'll just say shock, right? The sad, tragic story of people, committing suicide when they go to the bank and they find that, the bank account they've had for 20 years and they've been saving their pennies literally every month is gone. It's evaporated, right? And so that story was multiplied tens of thousands of times. The story of the hard scrabble farmer who owns maybe 30 acres of marginal farmland, who struggles year in and year out to make that payment. And then the depression hits, there's no market for their crop, and then the sheriff comes with maybe to foreclose, right? Tom Joad. A lot of your viewers have seen The Grapes of Wrath. Here's something they don't see. John Steinbeck was not a socialist. But this is a scenario I'm going to share with you that you can read a newspaper from the early 1930, 31, 32, 33, and you can track me, you can check me on this, because initially the capitalists see the Great Depression as a great opportunity to grab land. That's how capitalism works. You don't think about what's for the benefit of my neighbor or my community. You think, what's for the benefit of me? And so the foreclosure is a way to like grab up all of this farmland. And so we see that happening in the famous opening of Grapes of Wrath. Grapes of Wrath is a magnificent piece of literature. I don't want to trash it, but I'm just saying that John Steinbeck's interpretation or his analysis, the way he depicts working class people is they're victims, right? The Joad family are typical victims until the very end of the story, when they kind of go into a different kind of heroism. Anyway, but the reality of a lot of these foreclosures, Theresa, and this is where socialism comes in, is that after the initial shock, 1932, 33, sheriffs are going out and they're still foreclosing in places like Tompkins County, in central Iowa, in eastern Montana. But now things are a little different. Sometimes when the sheriff goes out to take your land from you and give it back to the bank or give it to the bank or another large owner, sometimes your neighbors are with you. And the sheriff is like, what's going on here? And some of the neighbors have shotguns. And sometimes they barricade the roads and they don't allow the sheriff to make it down the road. That is, they're stopping capitalists from being capitalists, right? And they're saying that, and this is where I think organic kind of socialism, some of these people were in the Socialist Party, others most probably were not, but they were beginning to question capitalist, not only capitalist relations of production, but capitalist ownership. Is it right to take someone's land? Is it really right for the Joad family to lose their land to a bank because they can't make the payment, right? And so that was beginning to happen. The other thing is these marches from, you can imagine a march from, and these happen again in Ithaca. You can check me on this. People marching from these small towns out in Cortland, marching down to downtown Ithaca City Council and saying, we demand that the council and the mayor do something to relieve the conditions of poor people. Now, you mentioned the unemployed movements that you participated in maybe in the 70s and 80s, but I want us to think about what it was like to be there in 1931 and 1932 and demand unemployment relief. That was a socialist activity. That was stunning for the
And
capitalists. Yeah.
who were some of the socialist labor leaders of the time? Because by then, our hero Eugene V. Debs had died.
These are people like Karl Korstadt, who's a socialist, who was a member of the Communist Party, who was the head of UCAPAWA, or the Food, Tobacco, Agricultural Workers in Eastern North Carolina. Some of these are people like Luisa Moreno, Emma Tanayuca, who is also a socialist, who led the pecan workers strike in San Antonio, Texas. There were members of the Communist Party, like I mentioned, Rose Chernin earlier. There were never a majority in most unions or most unemployed movements, but they were there. Or I should say, we were there. Our ancestors in struggle were there. And Rose Chernin was a person who always pushed the envelope. And people like Sidney Hillman, even. Now, I'm getting a little ahead of myself because Hillman, of course, becomes a big socialist labor leader in the New Deal, right? But many of them had these incredible radical pedigrees. What I mean by this is, Theresa, is that Luisa Moreno and Emma Tanayuca are, we would call them, Latina labor organizers now, but they brought with them from the Caribbean and from Latin America socialist, anarcho-syndicalist, feminist ideas about women in leadership. Women should be leaders. You also had A. Philip Randolph. Randolph was the president of the Sleeping Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and Maids, very active in the early New Deal. But what they were pushing for was quite revolutionary in 1931 and 32. This is before industrial unionism really takes off, by the way. But the idea that the state should be responsible in part for economic hardship was considered to be revolutionary. I want everyone to please, that's a takeaway from our discussion, insisting that the state take responsibility for economic hardship was revolutionary in the 1930s, and the state treated it that way. Rose Chernin and people like that who's tried to stop their neighbors from being evicted from Harlem or from South Bronx or Western Queens tenements were beaten by the police. They were arrested. They were blacklisted. Some of them were shot down in broad daylight because they were demanding the sheriff stop these foreclosures. They were demanding that the city or the municipality supply food or aid for heating relief or things like that. Francis Perkins, by the way, if you look at a lot of people talk about the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, that people like Francis Perkins, who later taught here at ILR, but she was a four-term Secretary of Labor for Franklin Roosevelt. The idea of public employment was revolutionary in the early 30s. The notion that you'd have a civilian conservation corps, that you would put unemployed men and women to work and they would be paid by the state to build bridges and roads and parks and things like that we continue to enjoy to this day. Originally, that was seen as red Bolshevism, right? And Francis Perkins was red baited constantly. They tried to, National Chamber of Commerce tried to get Francis Perkins to advocate for the deportation of another socialist red labor leader I know you've talked about before, Harry Bridges, right? They wanted Harry Bridges, president of the International Longshoremen Warehousemen's Union, out of the country, right, back to Australia. And Perkins refused to go along with it. By the way, she didn't like his personal life. He was a he was a philanderer. Let's be clear, right? He was very, that was kind of his. He was a very macho kind of male guy. Um, but the Chamber of Commerce didn't care about that. They cared about the fact that he led these successful strikes, and that's why they wanted him out. But socialism was an exciting. I'll use the term panoply. There's so many different menus. There's so many different tendencies: anarcho-syndicalism, syndicalism, anarchism, labor socialism, politics at the point of production, communism, a viable communist party. What does socialism look like when you have a viable communist party? Whether or not you agree with it or not, it has an institution. It has a newspaper, right? That millions of people are reading. So it was a very vibrant political culture in the early 30s, which I think, as a labor historian, Theresa, it's so fun for me to talk about workers eventually making the New Deal because I can kind of pick and choose. I interviewed retired African American coal miners, right, in the early 1990s who built the CIO in southern Alabama. My God. Oh my God. I mean, their fathers had some of them been then shot down in broad daylight or machine gunned by gun thugs, in southern Alabama. And here they are in 1934 doing these sit down strikes in the coal mines. And when I remember interviewing some of these retired coal miners, Teresa, they told me they're very proud of what they had achieved. One of the things they told me was, a son, and I remember this man, Leon Alexander, 6'4". When I went to shake his hand, my hand disappeared. He'd been a coal miner his entire life, right? He had been one of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s bodyguards when Dr. King came to Birmingham in the 60s. Dr. King was always surrounded by these very large black men. They were almost all of them were labor union leaders, many of them black socialists. Their job was to keep Dr. King safe. But one of the things that Leon Alexander shared with me is he said, y'all always are talking about those leaders up north. He said it's the black miners in the South who built the CIO.
Well, and then somehow it gets into the Democratic Party under Franklin Roosevelt. Thank you, Paul Ortiz. This has been a lot of new information about some times that have some meaning for us now.
No doubt.
This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.